a few things concluding our study of the Pharisees, and then tonight we're going to get right into the next topic on our outline, the Sadducees. Last time we were talking about two basic areas where Jesus and the Pharisees would have had disagreements, or where he disagreed with them. The first of those, I said, was their gross lack of personal piety. The second one, I said, was that Jesus opposed their traditions, which they had added to the Word, which invalidated their system of theology. Now, I guess the last thing I want to say concerns the identification of the sinners, S-I-N-N-E-R-S, the sinners in the Gospels. You say, well, I know what a sinner is. Well, what about those occasions where we find the term sinners often in conjunction with the publicans or with tax collectors? They say, or I guess Jesus is often the one saying it, something about publicans and sinners, something about tax collectors and sinners. Well, what is the identification of these sinners? I mean, it can't mean sinners, because what's the publican but a sinner? I mean, a tax collector, as far as the Jewish people were concerned, was a sinner. So you'd have just an unnecessary repetition on your hands, the sinners and the sinners. Tax collectors and sinners, he must have reference to some type of sinner. Now, it wasn't that Jesus had a big problem with either one of these two groups of people. It wasn't that he would approve of everything that they stood for either, but those words are not his own. Those words come from the Pharisees of his day. But places like in Matthew 9, verses 10 through 13, and Mark 2:16, and Luke 5:30, and Luke 15:2. Those are the places that speak of tax collectors or publicans and sinners. So sinners, that's not just some general word like we would use it, because, as I say, what are the tax collectors but sinners? In the rabbinical writings, they have a certain particular Hebrew word. It's translated from the Greek, of course, as sinners in the English, but they have a certain particular designation for these people. In Hebrew, it's Am Haaretz. You can spell it the best you can. It's Am Haaretz, which translates as the people of the land. They're called sinners in the Gospels, but the rabbis had a name for them, Am Haaretz, the people of the land. And what it referred to were those many people in Israel who had perhaps neither the time nor the inclination for the Pharisaic scribal scruples, or to say it another way, for these systems of men that we studied last Friday night in Matthew chapter 15 and in Mark 7. Now, you wouldn't get that just from the term sinner. You would think someone who's violating some commandment of God. Now, on the contrary, sinner as someone who violated one of the traditions of men, the Hama'aretz, the people of the land. They didn't live according to the halakha law. You know, that was the tradition of the elders, case decisions and so forth, which had been handed down. And they didn't abide by this halakha law, particularly in the area of eating food, you know, in a state of scribal uncleanness. If you turn over to John, I don't really want to take the time to look at all those other passages that I just mentioned to you, but I do want to look at John 7. Those other ones simply give references in this twofold manner to the publicans, or the tax collectors and sinners. But in John 7 and verse 49, I think we really have the expression of the views of the Pharisees concerning these people. John 7 and 49. We'll have to read a little earlier to get the context. Back in 32, a delegation had been sent out comprised of the Pharisees, and they had gone to test Jesus in his words and to listen to what he had to say. And that would involve some of the temple police force. Then came the officers to the chief priests and Pharisees, and they said unto them, Why have you not brought him? The officers answered, Never a man spake like this man. Then answered them, the Pharisees, "Are ye also deceived? Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed on him?" Look at verse 49. Now, John is quoting what they had to say, but it's an interesting inclusion here. "But this people who knoweth not the law are cursed." And then Nicodemus gives his famous response. One little small, very small verse, "But this people who knoweth not the law are cursed." What do they mean there? Well, that's not some reference to the Old Testament law. That's a reference to their own traditions. And of course they came, and this was our study, or the end of it anyway, last Friday night, they came to view their own traditions as of equal value and authority and importance on the same level as the Old Testament law itself. They had elevated their own traditions that far. And we saw last time Jesus said, because you've done that, then you have made shipwreck of your whole system of theology. It'd be one thing to have a little tradition or two, that would also make shipwreck, but it's another when one elevates that. And if you have any tradition, obviously you believe it's right or you wouldn't be doing it. So you don't have to make a big case for it. If it's just some tradition of man that's spoiling the liberty that God's people are to have, and that is in violation to God's Word, then their system has been made shipwreck. So John 7:49, I think, is a reference to this. This people who knoweth not the halakha law, the oral tradition, the commandments of men. This people who knoweth not the law are cursed. You couldn't say knoweth not the law, Old Testament, of the Jewish people. They all knew the law. Deuteronomy 6 had commanded their parents to raise every Jewish child knowing the law of Moses. But what the people didn't know is something that some of them didn't have the time or the inclination, perhaps. A lot of them would fit in the latter regard, I guess. They didn't have the inclination to study some of the scruples of the scribes and their disciples, the Pharisees. And as a result, the religious hierarchy looked down on them with scorn and contempt. Then we could raise another question here. Why didn't the Pharisees just simply treat Jesus as one of the ha'aretz and just pronounce, a curse upon him? Verse 49, "This people who knoweth not the law are cursed." Well, they couldn't just treat him like one of them and ignore him because he was too active and bold in his teaching. He didn't go around not observing the traditions of the Pharisees. He went around both not observing and teaching against. And the ordinary Jew would never do that. The ordinary one would think, well, the scribes and the Pharisees, they are a little academic and a little intellectual and a little stiff, but let them be. We'll live our life and they can live theirs. And they didn't want to be bound by those laws. Jesus also was not bound by them, but he took a step further. He took the offensive and actually taught against those teachings. And so the people the religious leaders became especially incensed with him and over him and desired his death, and that is eventually what they saw. Now, I guess I need to maybe say this as a parenthesis. This was laid on my heart today anyway in our studies. We've had a lot of good studies in this class on the last few months and looking at the religious leaders. And perhaps it is just difficult, if not impossible, for us living in a free, quote-unquote, country and society where you're not forced to believe anything and where people will basically tolerate you and so forth. It's difficult to understand the real pressures and warfare and excitement of what's going on here in the Gospels, or what happened back in the Reformation days, or something like that, or what's happening today in foreign countries where you're persecuted for your message of truth and light. There's an entirely different atmosphere. Today in denominational USA, with all the denominations, you just have this anemic, weak, lukewarm type of belief that they have their views and I have my views, and there's not a lot of controversy or not a lot of stirring up over the matter. We either have to get stirred up in the Word of God, so we go out preaching the truth as the Word tells us to, or we'll find it may be an and, sooner or later, we'll find ourselves in a situation where it is a must. But we don't know. No one in this country knows what it's like, unless you've come from overseas, to live under a regime that forces beliefs on you, that compels, that commands, that forbids and prohibits certain things. None of us know anything of what that is about. When you go back to the only comparison that we might have, and I said this in some recent message in a totally different connection, the only comparison we might have is that feeling or that thought of fear that a person might have who leaves some denominational church for a charismatic work, and especially for a very narrow charismatic work, where that work seems to be implying, in so many words, perhaps stating it, that all the others are wrong. And you find it very, very difficult, at least in the initial stage, to shake yourself from that bondage, to shake yourself from that attachment. And I guess I'm thinking now of what took place during the Reformation era, when the whole world, for centuries upon centuries, had been Roman Catholic. The whole world, with only a handful of exceptions here and there. And they were always martyred anyway, so they didn't live long enough to say much about it. And then to begin to have, and we saw some of the causes for, at least from the natural side, or some of the avenues through which God worked, the Reformation in biblical literature, revival of the classics and learning, and people began to study in the original tongue. It didn't just fall like out of heaven on a parachute to Martin Luther in 1517. You know, he was a product of others before him, and he didn't just discover this all of a sudden. And Calvin didn't just discover it all of a sudden. There were processes that led up to this. But to have to go against what the whole world was at that time, Roman Catholic, was a tremendous, tremendous step. You lost your inheritance. You lost your family name. You lost your security. You were, as far as all of your faith had taught you thus far, you were consigned to eternal damnation. And you were caught and tried and executed as a heretic, because most of the states of Europe, the countries, were controlled by the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope in Rome had such tremendous sway over those people that the leaders had to bow before the Pope. Now, on occasions, one of the leaders, like maybe the Spanish leader of the Holy Roman Empire, would have so much sway, the Pope would have to bow before him. But more often than not, the other European leaders were bowing before another European leader, and that European leader was the Roman Catholic Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And it was a tremendous struggle that the people had to go through. To fight, and I mean in the spiritual sense, to fight and to have to give up these traditions and to go against things that they had been taught. Worship of Mary and prayers for the dead and rosary and beads and statues and relics, and I mean there was a whole trade and traffic just in bones and splinters of wood and pieces of skin and hairs and things like that. John Calvin, whenever he was a boy, of course born in France, he was of French origin, although he's I guess known more as a Swiss teacher because of his stay in the city of Geneva for so long, but as a little boy before his mother died when he was young, he was taken on this little pilgrimage to the most famous church near him, and he was allowed to look and to touch and all the relics. And you know what they had? A couple of hairs from John the Baptist. Now he believed all of that as a little boy. Can you believe that? A couple of John the Baptist hairs. And of course every church had the splinters of the cross. And I think I've said before, if you put all the splinters together, you could build a barge larger than Noah's barge. You certainly couldn't, all those couldn't be valid splinters of the cross. Maybe a few of them could be, but not all of them, because it built something so huge that, you know, it couldn't possibly be a cross. But there also, they had the skull of one of the early saints there, and Calvin, and you come across in his writings how he rubbed that old skull there. It's probably the skull of some horse thief that had died, you know, the century before or something. But this was supposed to go back to the days of the apostles here. And to have to break away from all of that, it's a tremendous thing. But of course, Calvin did. Amen. And Martin Luther did. And they weren't the first two. They had their mentors. Calvin had one mentor, Farel, F-A-R-E-L, who came before him, much older than him. Another a more fiery than Calvin, French leader, and Calvin learned under him. And Farel was so fiery, I remember a couple of episodes, I'm comparing all this to Jesus' fight against all these hundreds of traditions during his day. And today in our denominational setting, we're told it doesn't make any difference. Major on the essentials, major on points of agreement. The other things don't matter. Well, that just ushers in a whole spirit of apathy and compromise. And before you know it, the true gospel of Christ has been completely suffocated by the laws and traditions of men. As soon as you allow one of those in, you allow 2 and 3 and 4 of those in. So these arguments, well, these things aren't important, those arguments are not valid. Not according to Scripture, not according to the whole history of God ever trying to reach down and renew any of the elements of His church. But anyway, Pharaoh, and this wasn't something isolated. He just did it all the time. And I can't remember if he ended up being martyred or not, but they were generally somehow escaping their persecution. As a matter of fact, the first time Calvin ever escaped, you can guess how it was. It was in a basket out a window over a wall. But that was the very first time. First time he escaped, and he had many other times. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of them, where the Roman Catholic authorities were after him. Now, you see, you don't have people chasing you, not yet anyway, in America. And they had to come up with reasons and so forth why it was scriptural to be able to escape. We talked about that in public education recently. Some of the things they did I don't think was right. Calvin went by false names in almost every town. I think that's deception, to pretend you have another name when you don't have it. But anyway, to get back to Pharaoh, you know, these companies of Roman Catholic priests would journey from one little village to another in their saying of the Mass. They would go over here and then go over there, and they'd go back and forth. And there'd always be a company of them together. And Pharaoh would hide in bushes and jump out from beside the road and grab their beads and rosaries off of them and throw them into the river and run before they could catch him. Hallelujah. Now, that wasn't something, that really did any damage. They could just go buy or make some more. But he was so zealous, he hated seeing any of those relics anymore. And when he could get a hold of a statue or something, he'd smash it if he could get away with it. And he would steal the beads, from the priest. And then on another occasion, in a Roman Catholic church, whenever he could, and this happened on more than one occasion, he would burst through the doors of the window just at the time the old Roman Catholic priest is intoning in Latin the Mass up there, get up in the pulpit with him and shout, drowning him out, preaching the gospel. And it'd only be a second or two before people would be after him, and back out the window he'd go and run off. I mean, he was zealous. Calvin learned under this man. Calvin was fiery, but he was more of a scholar. Pharaoh was like Luther. He was a bull, a reformer, and he got out there and did the dirty work. Calvin sat behind closed doors and wrote about it in the institutes. But Calvin had his own fair share of doing things like that, trying to break the hold of tradition in their lives and in the lives of the people around them. And so I'm sure the Roman Catholic attitude toward them, well, I know it was John 7, verse 49. These people who don't obey and who don't know the traditions are cursed. But on the contrary, if we read the whole New Testament, we find out we're cursed if we put ourselves under man's tradition. That's Matthew 15 and Mark chapter 7. So that should bring to a conclusion, I think, our study of the Pharisees. Jesus was critical of them in two regards: their gross lack of personal piety and the weight that they afforded to their own traditions. If you don't have any questions on the Pharisees, we will begin with the Sadducees. The Sadducees. Now, I had a note to start in the very beginning of this study of the Sadducees, so that if there's anyone out there who knows what I'm going to say, won't be sitting out there just waiting until I'm going to say it. There is a typical, traditional, however, in my opinion, completely stale joke that is told about the Sadducees in every little lay discussion of them. And it's supposed to be this: the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. We know that from Scripture. They are sad, you see. Stale. So I want to say that so that no one's hoping I'll really end a strong sermon with that stale joke. And can you believe this? I had this plan to say. I got a letter in the mail last week. I couldn't believe it. I didn't even tell my wife this, from one of her relatives. I couldn't believe it, but it was to us. And they had been studying about the Sadducees, And there was that little joke in there. I learned this about the Sadducees. They don't believe in the resurrection. They're sad, you see. I just shook my head. I couldn't believe I was going to say that this week, you know. And here I get one of these goofy letters in the mail. How many of you have ever heard that stale joke before? Well, it's only a few hands. Maybe I should have ended a sermon with that. You'd have thought, what powerful rhetoric there. I've heard it so many times that I've grown stiff and bored with it, so I didn't want to make you bored with it. So we got that off our chest and mind to begin with. I don't think that's where they got their name. Let's start with their origin then. Now, a lot that we've covered concerning the Pharisees also concern the Sadducees. We're not going to be on them very long at all. It's remotely possible we will be through with them tonight. If we're not, we'll be through with them next time. It's not as though there are a lot of similarities between the Pharisees and Sadducees, but in discussing that, just the opposite, as a matter of fact. And in discussing the Pharisees and some of their beliefs, we had to discuss their opponents, the Sadducees, and their beliefs. So some of that, a lot of that, has already been touched on before. Their name first appears in the time of John Hyrcanus. See, we already know that because when we discussed the origin of the Pharisees, we had to discuss the origin of the Sadducees. They rose up as mutually opponent groups. This was somewhere around the year 135 BC. And, of course, at that time, they are a sect rivaling the Pharisees. Perhaps the Pharisees come a little bit after them. We're not for sure of that. But they are rivals from early on. Now, it appears that they were religious people. The Sadducees were religious people who supported Hellenization. That is, they were in support, almost, we could say, of the foreign Seleucid control of Palestine. They didn't like all the atrocities, I'm sure, committed by people like Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, but they were in agreement with the worldliness and the Hellenization of the Jewish people. And they were also supporting the non-Aaronic Jewish high priesthood. That, of course, came about as a result of the Jewish independence movement under the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, Mattathias, the father, and all of those sons that you remember, Judas and Simon and Jonathan. Their name, what does that mean in the Hebrew? Well, there's a lot of debate over what their name means. It appears to mean the righteous ones. The righteous ones. Tzeduk in Hebrew means righteous or just. Tzeduk. So Sadducee evidently comes from that. Who coined the term? Well, probably they coined it. It'd be a good name to call yourself, the righteous ones. Most of the information that we have on them comes from the sources of their enemies. So some of these, may not be reliable, in other words. They didn't leave us documents of their own. Most of the information we have on them comes from the sources of their enemies. For instance, Josephus, he has a lot on the various Jewish religious sects of the first century. What did Josephus end up being after he had tried all the groups? Well, he was a Pharisee. So he had been in a scene and he had tried all the religious sects. He ends up, however, at the age of 18 or 19 as a Pharisee. The Talmudic writings contain some on the Sadducees, but by whom were they written? Well, they came from the pens of the rabbis who themselves were the descendants of the now defunct Pharisees. Pharisees ceased to exist after the dispersion of the nation in AD 70. That is, ceased to exist as a distinct group called the Pharisees. But their descendants, the rabbis, the great famous rabbis of Talmudic days who wrote the Talmud, their descendants come on the scene, write the Talmud, give us information about the Sadducees, but some people have said, and of course it's very possible, if not likely, that the information they give is slanted. Then the other source we have for Sadducee material is the New Testament, and it doesn't quite like them either. Of course, the one benefit we have with the New Testament, we know that it will tell us the truth. Even if we couldn't trust Josephus or the Talmud, we could trust the New Testament, even though all three of these are really enemies of the Sadducees. And when you compare, I'll just say this, concluding our little brief foray into their origin, Josephus and the Talmudic comments with the New Testament, they basically agree. So I don't see any great need to fear Josephus and Talmudic references or statements concerning the Sadducees, since those are enemies of them, because what they say agrees with the New Testament whenever they both speak on the same matter. Okay, let's give our discussion of the Sadducees under a few points here. That is their origin there. And their origin, we could go into more detail, but it's the same as what we've already got on tape concerning the Pharisees, with all of the things going on back in the 2nd century BC. All right, number one. As they always had been since pre-New Testament days, they continue to be rivals of the Pharisees. We've already studied this earlier, so I don't see any point in going into that in detail. They continue to be rivals of the Pharisees. You may remember that one of the objections to that, some of the critical scholars have brought up, is the fact that they are seen together in Matthew chapters 3 and 16, where the two nouns are governed by one article, Sadducee and Pharisee, or Sadducees and Pharisees are governed by one article, the. And the critical argument goes something like this: if they really were rivals, how can we have one article governing both nouns, and then coming together to see John in Matthew 3 and to see Jesus in Matthew 16? Well, we've already covered that before. I said probably they came as representatives of the Sanhedrin. The Pharisees came representing at least one part, the scribes, who made up part of the Sanhedrin. The Sadducees came representing another part, at least one part, the priests, the high priests, that group, which made up part of the Sanhedrin. And so when Matthew is joining names together, governed by one article, he doesn't mean to imply that the Sadducees and Pharisees were best of friends on best terms and agreed about everything. It's just they came together because they were sent by one force or one institution, the Jewish Sanhedrin. And furthermore, it would be easy to explain, as I've said earlier, how a common enemy could unite people who were earlier at odds with one another. But Matthew is the New Testament book that contains most of the references to the Sadducees. They appear by name 14 times in the New Testament. 7 are in Matthew, 1 in Mark, 1 in Luke, and 5 in Acts. So you see Matthew really outnumbers Luke by 1, 7-6, when you add Luke and Acts together. And Mark and Luke, the one in Mark and Luke, parallel a couple of the last ones in Matthew. So Matthew's are the important ones anyway. Well, they're rivals of the Pharisees. We studied that earlier. Secondly, although the Pharisees are more numerous and hold a greater sway over the people, the Sadducees are the ones who control the priesthood and the high priesthood. So someone is in control of the lay people, and someone is in control of official hierarchy, the leading official hierarchy in the land of Israel. The Pharisees control the people. The Pharisees are more numerous. I mean, just by number, they are more than the Sadducees. So they're in greater control of the people. They touch their lives more greatly than the Sadducees. But the Sadducees are the ones who control the priesthood and the high priesthood, which means they control the temple liturgy in many regards. There are a few regards, however, where even the Sadducees, because of the great prominence of the Pharisees in the eyes of many of the lay people, the Sadducees had to comply to Pharisaic ritual. And most importantly, the Sadducees are in control of the Jewish Sanhedrin. which is the civil as well as religious court in Israel. The president, or the high priest, the chief priest, the highest one, the one who's now ruling, well, the one who's deposed as well, had to be a Sadducee. Now, not everyone who was in the Sanhedrin had to be a Sadducee, but the Sanhedrin had to be controlled by the Sadducees. So the president of the Sanhedrin had to be a Sadducee, which is the same as saying the high priest. The ruling high priest also had to be a member of the Sadducee party. Then in the third place, the Sadducees were the rich, influential, aristocratic group in Israel. Remember that the Pharisees didn't have to have any particular training. Now, their leaders, the scribes, did. But they didn't have to have any particular training. They were lay members, as it were. Even the scribes had to hold down other jobs, but that was especially true of the Pharisees because they didn't have anything to make a living by. They weren't teachers in any official sense or anything. They were, as we have described them earlier. Well, on the contrary, the Sadducees don't fit that description at all. They are very rich and very influential. They come from important families. For the most part, there is agreement between the noun Sadducee and the noun chief priest. And remember, the chief priests, which fall in several different divisions, or many of them, they come from important families. Now, not every Sadducee was a chief priest, but every chief priest was a Sadducee.
For the continuation
Now, not every Sadducee was a chief priest, but every chief priest was a Sadducee. Not every Sadducee was a chief priest. There were just some Sadducees who were still influential and rich and tied into right people and had proper, good, beneficial connections, but who were not in any of these high priestly or chief priestly divisions or positions that we have studied earlier when we looked at the subject of Jewish priests. But they are still rich and influential and aristocratic nonetheless. They hold very high, powerful positions in Israel. And I think that it's as a result of this that these two groups, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, would most naturally be the ones concerned about political stability in Israel. They would be the ones most concerned about political stability, because if something happens so that the government is shaken, then the welfare of the nation is dependent upon that. And the welfare of the nation is not some abstract something. It concerns those people who hold the purse or the strings of the purse of the welfare of the nation. And those would be the people we're describing now, discussing the Sadducees. It's like in any country. You can go back during any wartime. Sometimes the people who are opposed to war, like maybe I'm thinking of some wars in Europe in the past, the people who were opposed to that were the rich and influential people. Because listen, if war strikes, war on your own ground, on your own territory, and inflation just goes out of this world and money becomes worthless, has no value at all, then you are in no different position or condition yourself than all the poor people. You were at one time a leader in the land, a leader in the nation, because of your rich, influential, powerful position. But if the country is brought to its knees by a foreign power, oftentimes you're no better off. And that's something that people need to remember, that in a situation like ours, where we haven't had war on our shore for over 100 years now, we don't know what war is all about. We don't know. All it takes is, you just study a little about Germany and what happened after the First and Second World War, and what happened to the German currency, the German mark, completely without value. I mean, if you've got a ruined economy, then you've got a ruined economy, and a ruined economy equals a ruined currency as well. It has no value at all. if your nation is the one that falls. Well, even if your nation isn't, our country went through some difficult times then. But you go back to the Civil War, and the South, the Confederacy, they had their own money, and it was different money than the Yankees in the North had. And it was completely full of value as far as the South was concerned. You couldn't spend it in the North, but it was Confederate money. It was real money for them. It paid their bills for them. Well, whenever they lost the Civil War, there were many Southerners who were, well, by today's standard, millionaires in Southern Confederate, now illegal currency that became worthless completely. It wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. That happened overnight. People lost fortunes because another power, namely the northern part of the United States, because another power came in and subdued them and took over, and it brought ruin and bankruptcy to many people in the South. I don't know if you know that about the Civil War, but people who in this country are hoarding things up, and all it takes is one little war on your own soil, and if you go under, your economy goes under, and the rich often aren't any different than the poor. I know you know what happened with stock market crash in 29 and things like that, or at least you've heard of that and read about that. People who had a lot invested in that lived in Hoovervilles from then on out because they didn't have anything. They lost it all. Well, you can see it disappear almost as quickly. Not quite, but almost as quickly whenever war comes to your own soil. So what I'm saying about the Sadducees is they're very concerned then that stability reigning government, which is just another way of saying that they are in either direct or indirect support of Roman rule. Roman rule is what? Pax Romana. There's peace over the world. We want peace here. Now, if we give in to some of these zealots that we'll study later on, or maybe even some of the more radically inclined Pharisees, or especially if we gave in to someone like the Hasmonean leaders. I mean, they supported them after it's all over with, you see, because now we've got peace. But give in to that type of spirit now, a revolutionary type spirit, no way. What happens, the Romans are going to come in and crush the government. And isn't that what happened a few decades later? The Sadducees were wise enough to know that. And so they were foolish enough to support the Roman government. For instance, if you turn over to Mark chapter 12, we have here in Mark 12 one of the synoptic accounts of the tribute question, what we could call the tribute question. And if you note in verse 13, there is a very conspicuous absence with the mention of the parties sent to Jesus to ask him about this matter, of a reference to the Sadducees. The question about tribute to Caesar came from Pharisees and Herodians, not from Sadducees. Because the Sadducees wouldn't want to pose any type of question that would even put Jesus in the possible position of saying something against Caesar, against Rome. And they certainly wouldn't want to be reporting that back for fear of what it would do to already just, well, a national underlying seething that the nation would be experiencing via foreign domination. We're talking about the Jews, remember, who had all of God's Old Testament promises that the whole of the Levant belongs to you because I gave it by promise to Abraham. The Jewish nation as a whole isn't just existing passively under this foreign rule. There's a very large element of the population, maybe most of them, who perhaps wouldn't come out and say so in as many words, but who are seething at the thought, we are the people of God. We are controlled by foreign, pagan, heathen Gentiles. There's something terribly wrong with that. And of course there was. They were being punished for their sins, though, as Jeremiah tells us. They had fallen into that with Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians and had never completely gotten out of that, but for a relatively short period of what we call Hebrew independence. So it would only make sense, I'm saying, that the Sadducees wouldn't bring up this tribute question or a Caesar question or a government question because they are in tacit support of the Roman government, because they are in support of their own position. And they have to have stability to ensure that. My argument that I'm giving to you right now, I think, also accords well with the attitude of Caiaphas over in John 11, verses 47 through 54. Caiaphas, remember who he is at this time? He's high priest, is he not? So he's a Sadducee. Well, if my argument's valid so far, then Caiaphas would not want to do anything to upset the Romans. Pharisees aren't exactly like that. We've got differences in their midst, but the Sadducees, with one voice of consent, the whole group would be in favor of stability, which means they are in favor of Roman government. John 11:47, then gathered the chief priest and the Pharisees a council, it's the Sanhedrin, and it mentions two parts of the Sanhedrin there. The chief priests, well, they would be Sadducees by religious affiliation. You see, chief priest is to that part of the question what scribe is to the other part. A scribe is an occupation, a vocation, a calling, a job, something that you do, a scribe. A Pharisee, and most of the scribes were Pharisees, Pharisee is a denominational name tag, a religious persuasion. Well, that same type of distinction is to be held between chief priests and Sadducees. Chief priest is what you do for a living. It's what you are. It's what position you hold. Sadducee, that's religious persuasion. What do we? For this man doeth many miracles. We let him thus alone. All men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. See, they're very concerned about anything that will upset the status quo of the Jewish ethos. And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, that the whole nation perish not." Of course, he doesn't exactly know what he's saying by that. Or he's meaning one thing, and the Spirit which is speaking through him, as John tells us in the next couple of verses, the Spirit speaking through him is meaning something else entirely. He's thinking it'd be best if one die rather than have, the whole nation perish. But what happens is really both of those things are fulfilled. One does die, Jesus, and then the whole nation perishes in AD 70. See, it would have been best not to compromise. You compromise and you lose not only the thing that you wanted to keep, but you get the thing that you didn't want. That's always what compromise does. You think you can hold on to something and it never works. You lose that and you lose everything in the process. So I think that would more or less substantiate what I've said. We'll see this again in Acts chapter 4. Then in the fourth place, another statement about the Sadducees, introducing you to them. They thought of themselves as the conservatives of the day. They weren't, but they thought of themselves as the conservatives of the day because they refused to accept and to follow the scribal halakha, the tradition of the elders. Now, I've mentioned that before because some scholars have said that the Pharisees, because they follow tradition, are the liberals, and the Sadducees, because they refuse to follow tradition and just stay with the Word, the Old Testament, they are the conservatives. And so they kind of cast them in a Protestant versus Catholic type scenario, with the Protestants being the Sadducees, who just stay with the Word, and the Catholics being the Pharisees, who also believe in tradition. Well, that's really not a fair presentation of them or their positions. I don't think we could cast them in a Protestant-Catholic thing, regardless of who you want to make as Protestant versus Catholic. But I don't think that this particular casting of them is fair at all for several reasons. In the first place, the Sadducees were the spiritually liberal in seeing nothing wrong with Hellenism and worldliness. I mean, if you're going to call them the conservatives, you're going to deal with the fact that they are certainly liberals in the area of morals and ethics. They see nothing wrong with the Greek names and the Greek language and, just doing away with your own native tongue and exercising in the nude and the gymnasium and all of this business that the Greeks had brought in through the Seleucids. So they are the spiritually liberal in seeing nothing wrong with Hellenism and worldliness. And secondly, they had their own traditions that they followed. Every false group has its traditions. Some are just more pronounced than others. Some wouldn't call them traditions, but they are. You know as well as I do, the Protestants, in my opinion anyway, have as many traditions as the Roman Catholics have. Amen. They would never call them that, though. They're always criticizing the Roman Catholics for their traditions. The Protestants have just as many, if not more. Probably more because there are more different, unique, distinctive Protestant groups. The Catholics are all the same. Well, that's an overgeneralization of it, but that's basically true. You got so many different Protestant groups, whether it's from a Lutheran background or Calvinistic or Pentecostal or Wesleyan, Arminian, whatever it is. They've got all types of traditions of their own. Hundreds and hundreds of them in their doctrine and in their practice and in their church and the building and what they wear and what they do and what they think and so forth. They would never call it that, of course. Or if they did, they'd say, well, we still submit to the Word. And our traditions, we don't put faith in that like the Catholics do. But that's another lie, though. They elevate their traditions to the level of the Word of God just as quickly as the Roman Catholics do. They're just more subtle in doing it. And that's what makes them more dangerous. Protestantism has a lot of truth. The Pharisees had a lot of truth. But that's exactly what makes a person dangerous. You've got a lot of truth, but you don't have it all. And you mix in just enough of that poison to contaminate and to damage everything else. So the Sadducees have their own traditions. They are not some Bible-believing, Bible-thumping group, tradition-free, free from all traditions of men. And also, I would say about the Sadducees, they rejected the clear teaching and message of the Old Testament in several regards, which will be our fifth point, which will bring us to that here in just a moment. You're talking about them being the conservatives. There's no way. They felt themselves to be conservative only in this one regard because they rejected halakha, tradition of elders. But just in that one regard, one isn't made a conservative. You'd have to have a lot of other things true of you. No, when we look at doctrine and so forth, the conservatives of that day are not the Sadducees, they are the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees, for the most part, are wanting to stay in line with the Old Testament. The Sadducees blatantly go against clear Old Testament teaching on several issues. And so let's come finally to our fifth point concerning the Sadducees. And that is, the Sadducees rejected what they thought were theological innovations of the Pharisees. In other words, what I'm going to be saying here is that they rejected some things that are clearly taught by the Old Testament, and their excuse was, well, this is simply Pharisaic scribal tradition. And it wasn't. It was based in the law, based in the Old Testament. And they rejected it with this little flimsy excuse, we don't follow the traditions of men. So the Sadducees reject what they think are some theological innovative inventions of the Pharisees. And those are the following. Number one, a full canon. That's Genesis to Malachi. The Sadducees reject that. Well, you couldn't be conservative and reject some of the Old Testament. And they reject most of the Old Testament. Bodily resurrection, they reject as a peculiar Pharisaic teaching. The existence of spirit beings in a spirit world, they reject. That was invented by the Pharisees, they claim. They reject predestination, that horrible decree, as the Arminians have accused Calvin of. And finally, they reject messianic expectation. Messianic expectation. Now, this is where we really get to the meat of the matter, if you want to know who and what the Sadducees were and were about. So let's discuss these things I just listed that they reject. They claim these are inventions of the Pharisees. They have no support in the Old Testament, or at least that part of it they agree upon and accept, and so they want to have nothing to do with it, and therefore they felt it was just self-deception, pure and simple, themselves to be the conservatives of their day. They were the most worldly religious sect in Israel, the Sadducees. They got involved in everything. I mean, they were head over heels in everything that everyone else was doing. They were not a separate, righteous, holy, pure people at all. The Pharisees would much better fit in that category than would the Sadducees. So let's discuss these things in reverse order. We'll start with Messianic hope then. Let's discuss them in reverse order. First of all, Messianic hope. Now, the Pharisees at least said they were looking for Messiah's advent. You couldn't prove that by me, though, whenever I see what they did whenever he came on the scene. But anyway, they at least said they were looking for Messiah's advent. The Sadducees, no problem at all. They didn't try to hide anything. They weren't looking for any coming of Messiah or a greater than Moses prophet or anything on that order. And I'll tell you why. That's because they believed the reign of the Messiah had already dawned in the victory of the Maccabees. Now, you have to kind of follow along their thinking here. Daniel had given some prophecies back in his book that the Jews were going to be under. If you kind of look in them and kind of interpret, you can kind of end up with this. The Jews are going to be under foreign Gentile domination for a long period of time. Does it name all the powers? You know, we know, well, Daniel, he knew there were 4. We can name them now looking back. The Maccabean revolt comes right in between Numbers 3 and 4. Well, of course, if you're living then, you don't know it. I'm talking about the Babylonians, Medes and Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans. The Romans haven't come on the scene yet. Julius Caesar hasn't arisen, and Pompey and so forth. Not back in 167, 165 B.C. And what we have in the Maccabean revolt is the reestablishment of Jewish Hebrew independence. That's a whole part of our earlier political study in this class ITP. Remember, the Babylonians control them, then that passes to the Medes and Persians, then that passes to the Greeks, and then does that pass to the Romans? No, you've got a period of Hebrew independence for 100 years. Of course, the Sadducees at that time, back in the 2nd century BC, they don't have the help of hindsight now. They didn't know, well, we're only going to have this independence for so many years, and the Romans are going to come and take over us, and then we're going to be annihilated and scattered in the world, and that'll be the end of us as a national people in our homeland, Palestine. So what could they think but this is the dawning of the age of Messiah? With the overthrow of the Greek rule and the Greek Empire in Palestine by the Hasmonean dynasty, what could they think? But this is the dawning of the age of Messiah. We've overcome the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, and the Greeks. Now we have our own independent Jewish, Hebrew, religious self-rule, rule of ourselves. Daniel's prophecies must be over with then as far as Gentile domination of Israel is concerned. So it makes a lot of sense from the point of view of the 2nd century BC. Mattathias and his sons Judas and Jonathan and Simon, they inaugurated the Messianic age. And the Sadducees felt that it was their calling to keep it going. But, of course, it would appear that any alleged Messianic reign was rather self-defeating if the Romans could still come in and triumph just 100 years later. And so here the Sadducees are like the Jehovah's Witnesses. Once you get a date set for something, it doesn't work out that way, then you scurry about trying to re-explain things. Now, the Sadducees of the 1st century A.D. are without excuse. All they've got to do is look around them, and there are Roman troops and centurions stationed everywhere. That should be a proof to you the age of the Messiah has not come. When he comes, he'll come. Whenever he comes, he'll deliver his people. There won't be any foreign rule of them anymore. That theory would have been okay. Really not, because Daniel gives 4 powers, and only 3 had ruled them up until that time. But relatively speaking, taken in this context, that belief of the beginning, the dawning of the age of the Messiah, would have been allowable if you lived back in 135 BC, because you are now independent and you have no foresight of what's going to take place when the Romans come in and take over you. But the Sadducees of 1st century A.D. are without excuse. They can look around themselves and see the marks and signs of foreign, Gentile, here in this case Roman, domination of them everywhere. Age of Messiah has come? Hardly. We could ask them some questions. If the Messianic reign has begun, who is Messiah then? Or who was Messiah? We would really have to say who is, because the Old Testament tells us that when he comes, he'll live forever. That he'll sit up on the throne of David, and of his kingdom there'll be no end. So it really couldn't be Mattathias or Judas or Jonathan or Simon. The Herods have taken over, and now the Romans have taken over. So who is Messiah? And if the age of Messiah has begun, how can you explain Rome's domination of Israel? Rome is dominating Messiah then. That'd be impossible, even according to liberal Jewish theology. And so let's assume that Messianic age has not begun. If it hasn't begun, how may we explain the Sadducees' support of Rome? You should be looking for Messiah, not supporting some foreign power over you. The longer you support some foreign power over you, the longer you're ensuring that age of Messiah will not come. So this may be a little confusing to you, but that's okay. It was a whole confusing mess as far as I'm concerned. The Sadducees and their lack of any messianic belief or hope. It was all self-defeating. If it began, I'm saying, in 167, 165 BC, it's self-defeating because Messiah wasn't strong enough to keep the Romans out. And if it hasn't begun, how can you explain your own support of Rome? You're keeping Messianic age from ever breaking forth. So there's their belief in Messianic hope or lack thereof. Secondly, predestination. The Sadducees were the Arminians, the Wesleyans of their day, the Methodists of their day, in wanting to accomplish things on their own apart from some vain hope of heavenly help and intervention. They thought, as some Arminians have argued, well, that's a cop-out. To use popular terminology, I doubt Arminians said that in Holland back in the 1600s, but popular terminology, that's a cop-out. That's an excuse to get out from your own responsibilities of either choosing right or choosing wrong. So the Pharisees have a view not only of human responsibility and freedom, but of divine sovereignty and predestination. They weren't terribly biblical or not completely biblical, the Pharisees, in every regard in that doctrine and their construction of it, but the Sadducees were very far off. They completely denied the sovereignty of God or predestination. But their own Bible, or at least the part of the Bible they believed, taught that concept. I'll just give you one verse here, Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, where Joseph, after the death of his father Jacob, has all of his brothers fearful and trembling before him, thinking they know what Joseph is now going to do to them, punish them because of all the punishment they inflicted on him and all the misery they caused in his life. Well, Joseph in Genesis 50 and verse 20 is too kind and too righteous to punish his brothers. And he makes a statement along this line, don't worry about what's happened to me, because what you meant for evil, God meant for good. There in one verse you've included both. Human responsibility. What you meant for evil, God worked through human responsibility to effect what? Predestination and divine sovereignty. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. And how he has saved much people alive through that. If they had never done that, Joseph wouldn't be down there. Joseph wouldn't be the one supplying their needs as the second ruler behind Pharaoh in Egypt during that great famine. Then in the third place, I don't know that we're going to get any past this tonight, the Sadducees denied any invisible spirit world and spirit beings. They were the secularists of their day, the materialists. Luke, the New Testament writer, specifically informs us of this fact. Some of the other things we have to gather from other material. But in Acts 23 and verse 8, we are specifically informed of the fact that the Sadducees denied the existence of spirit beings or the spirit world. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Now that term spirit could probably be taken as a reference to evil angels, or we would say a demon. Neither angel nor spirit. What's the difference between an angel and a spirit? An angel is a spirit. Well, all angels are spirits, but not all spirits are angels. So this must be a reference to good spirits and bad spirits. So we would take that word spirit to refer to demon. And I guess here the KJV maybe is a little, it could be anyway, a little confusing because it gives us the word both after three nouns. It gives us three items: resurrection, angel, and spirit, and then says the Pharisees confess both. Well, you'd have to say all three to be proper. Well, no, not really. Probably what we have here is, in the mind of Luke, the writer here, angel and spirit, that's one thing. It's the spirit world, spirit beings. Resurrection is something else entirely. So the both refers not to angel and spirit, but to resurrection and the spirit world, or spirit beings. That's what the both refers to. The Pharisees confess both the resurrection and the existence of spirits. Spirit beings, the spirit world. Now you think of this, these are people who are Jews, people of God, descendants of Abraham, got the Old Testament, all this, and they deny there's any such thing as angels. Well, you couldn't call them the conservatives of their day. They obviously are the liberals. Amen. I mean, the conservatives of our day, they don't put a lot of emphasis in this area, but they at least believe in the existence of angels and demons. It's the liberal churches out there who mock and ridicule and laugh at that idea. Right. The Pharisees believed in angels and demons, so much so they went casting demons out, remember Matthew 12. So the Sadducees are the liberals of their day. They deny the existence of good spirits and bad spirits. And what they say is this is an innovation of the Pharisees. Well, to be sure, the intertestamental period itself, the whole thing, all 400 years, brought a heightened emphasis in Judaism on the spirit world, the existence of Satan and angels and demons. And I think just one reading of the apocryphal books will show this. And we've mentioned this on several occasions before anyway, that the whole intertestamental period brought with it, this was just God's development of Old Testament teaching for his people's benefit to prepare them for Jesus, the apostles, and New Testament times. But he brought through the intertestamental period a heightened awareness and emphasis that's not due just to the Pharisees, in other words, on the spirit world of angels and demons. But you don't have to look for angels and demons in the ITP alone, as though it's some non-canonical, between the testaments innovation of the Pharisees.